So, the 12 steps of ecological recovery. 1. We admitted we were powerless over excess, that our lives had become unmanageable. It seems like human beings have been devoted to accumulating surpluses for at least the past 12,000 years. Agriculture was born of the desire to live in one place and to accumulate the surpluses of food that would allow that to be possible. As greater and greater surpluses were stored up and piled up, for the first time human beings knew wealth, a concept which is really unknown in nature. Nature is a moneyless economy. But human beings created the first economy when they began to store the only thing that really at that point was truly valuable to them, which was food. They had decorations, beads, shells, obsidian spear points, and things like that, which they thought to be of value and which they clearly traded. But these things were never hoarded because people basically couldn't accumulate more of something than they could carry. But when human beings began to live a sedentary existence in large communities and began to grow huge quantities of agricultural products, suddenly for the first time we get classes, we get rules, laws, hierarchical structures. So we've been in the business of excess or surplus ever since then. And so now we can't really imagine anything but excess or surplus. Our whole culture is built on creating surpluses and excesses. So much of our motivational systems in life, the jobs we take, the careers we pursue are driven by this idea of accumulating more than we can actually use in any one given day. When Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, he's saying really, give us our bread for today. Give us today's meal. And to be in a position to ask for today's meal and to trust that we will be given today's meal is in fact to be at our very most human. Daito Kokushi, who was the founder of Daitokuji Monastery in Japan, one of the most famous monasteries. He was a very famous Zen master who spent a lot of time living underneath a bridge. He was declared the national teacher by the emperor. He could only put up with that for so long, founding monasteries and being an important bigwig, and so at one point he just simply disappeared, and they had to search for him all over Kyoto. The emperor, however, and his advisors knew of Daito's fondness for melons, and so some of his guards were sent out with very ripe, very beautiful melons, and were told to search among the beggars underneath various bridges in Kyoto and to say, whoever can come take this melon without walking on their feet, come take it, which is like a trick question, a Zen question, right? It's like a Zen koan. So he figured that they would lure Daito out on two pretexts. One, his love of melons, widely known love of nice ripe melons, and two, his ability to answer this kind of question as a Zen master, as the greatest living Zen master of that age. And so he did come out, but he said to the guards, first give it to me without using your hands. Then they knew they had their man. Daito himself was a person who understood this. He told his monks, don't worry about food and clothing. He said, as long as you have a mouth, you will have food. As long as you have shoulders, you will have clothing. It's a very beautiful way of looking at it. As long as you manifest a need as a human being, a very simple, direct, honest, straightforward need, your needs will be met. Oddly enough, when we as human beings begin to accumulate surpluses, suddenly there isn't enough to go around. Before we focus on surplus, there's more than enough. Human beings have more than enough. Human beings prior to the agricultural revolution, when they were still living as hunters and gatherers, only had to work about 20 hours maximum a week in order to feed themselves. Suddenly, after the agricultural revolution, they're having to work all the time. In fact, the Jews were considered a revolutionary people because they were the first people to say, we're going to rest one day a week. And people were freaked out by this idea. The idea of the Sabbath in the ancient agricultural world was like an affront to people's common sense. They said, we can't stop working for one day or we will all die. That was the widely held belief. That was people's experience. You could not relax your vigilance for one day of rest to just appreciate being alive and one another. So the Sabbath was, in fact, a very revolutionary idea. There's a famous passage from the Gospels where Jesus' disciples are seen walking through a field, plucking the ears of corn off of the stalks and eating them as they go along. And the Pharisees saw this and they condemned Jesus and his disciples because his disciples were working on the Sabbath. And Jesus, basically, what he actually said was, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But what he was really saying was, you've so lost touch with your original nature that you believe that walking through a field and picking the corn as you go and eating it as you go is work. This is life. This is not work. This is life. This is how human beings are supposed to live and how they live at their very best and most trusting. And he echoes this same language again and again. In the Sermon on the Mount, he says, consider the lilies of the field, how they toil not, neither do they spin. Yet even Solomon in all his finery was not arrayed like one of these. And he says the same thing about the birds that don't gather into barns, and yet your Heavenly Father feeds them. This is what he's talking about. So there are 12 more steps. That's just the first one, but that's good enough to begin with. We'll talk about the others briefly as we go along each week. We admitted we were powerless over excess, that our lives have become unmanageable. We are born into unmanageable lives in modern culture. We experience them as manageable as children when we trust, when we're given really what we need. It's interesting, children are frequently lavished with possessions, like if their parents are well-to-do or if the parents have a desire to spoil them. And yet, very young children only play with one thing at a time. And sometimes they will ignore all the many riches laid before them to play with, the simplest thing in which they take great joy. I'll never forget, as a parent of young children, giving them Christmas gifts when they were 2 and 3 years old, only to find that they ignored the gift and loved the wrapping paper and the boxes, which they played with for hours. Even though we had gone to great lengths to pick them, just to find them just the right gift, the thing they loved the best was the right wrapping paper. The kittens, I might add, are the same way. They love the bows, the wrapping paper. And so there's a sense that, at our most basic and most innocent, our needs are really very, very simple. And we learn excess, and we learn to invest in excess as we grow older, until by the time we're adults, it's so inculcated in us that we need to get into recovery to remember what it was like before. Thanks.